Out on those snow-choked Montana roads, a mother's hands clutch the steering wheel like it's the only thing keeping her whole life from falling apart. A battered truck pushes through the storm, her frightened son curled up beside her, hanging onto his worn-out blanket for dear life. The night outside is so cold, it feels like it could freeze the last bit of hope right out of them. But in the heart of that blizzard, when it seems like there's no way out and fear is chasing them through the trees, a wild act of mercy ties their fate to a wounded bobcat and her cub. In that moment, strangers become something more than just survivors. They become a family, and making it through the night turns into something almost sacred. How much would you risk for a second chance?
It's too cold out here.
How far would you go to protect your child, or help a wild creature hang on just a little longer?
We're safe
If this
now.
story speaks to you, let me know down in the comments. And if you want to hear more true stories about hope, courage, and wild connections, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support honestly means everything. Come on, step out into the snow with me and see where the story leads. Snow slammed against the windshield in wild, swirling sheets. Every blast of wind rocking the old pickup so hard, it felt like the whole world might shake apart. Grace's hands were locked tight around the steering wheel, knuckles pale as bone, eyes straining into the storm. The headlights barely cut through the Montana darkness, just a faint tunnel of yellow light before the world dissolved into chaos. White on white, broken only by shadows of trees and the hulking shape of distant mountains rushing by. The heater sputtered, blowing more noise than warmth, and every few seconds Grace shot nervous glances at the rearview mirror, half expecting flashing blue and red lights to come screaming up behind them. Eli was curled up in the passenger seat, knees hugged to his chest, staring wide-eyed out at the blizzard. He was so quiet Grace could hear his breathing, each shaky exhale misting the glass. He clung to a thin, orange blanket, the same ragged thing he'd carried through every move, every close call. In the brief lulls between howling gusts, she could almost hear his heartbeat, wild and frantic as her own. Everything behind them was swallowed by snow and dark. For a second, Grace wondered if it had ever really existed. The battered trailer with broken windows and icy silences, the heavy footsteps stomping through the halls, the shouting sharp as shattered glass. She tried to push the memories away, but they stuck to her like frost on the windshield. "Are we almost there, Mom?" Eli's voice was barely more than a whisper, as if he was afraid to wake up the night. Grace managed a soothing answer she didn't quite believe. "Almost, sweetheart. Just a little farther." The lie burned in her throat. She had no idea where there was, just away, anywhere but back, heading toward some flicker of hope. Another mile, another turn. The tires groaned over frozen ruts, headlights skimming over snow-choked road signs. Sometimes the truck shivered beneath them, like it wanted to give up, but Grace kept coaxing it forward, murmuring half-formed prayers under her breath. She glanced at Eli again, reaching over to brush a strand of hair from his forehead, the same gesture she'd used when he was little, when nightmares jolted him awake. But tonight, it wasn't make-believe monsters they were running from. It was a real man, a man who knew how to find them and wouldn't stop. Suddenly, the radio burst to life, jarring and loud. Grace jumped, heart pounding against her ribs. Just static at first, then a distant, serious voice. Blizzard warning, dangerous conditions. All non-essential travel should cease immediately. She twisted the volume down, but the warning stuck with her, echoing the fear she tried to swallow. A shape appeared through the snow, a battered wooden sign, paint almost gone. National Forest Boundary, No services, travel at your own risk. Grace's breath caught. This was the edge of nowhere. Good. That's exactly where she wanted to be. The snow thickened, smothering the last trace of moonlight. It felt like driving into the mouth of some enormous, hungry animal. The road grew rougher, the engine straining. Suddenly the headlights caught something. Paw prints crossing the road, already filling in with snow. Grace slowed, squinting into the night. Bobcat, maybe. Or coyote. Out here, things survived by being invisible. Do you think he knows where we are? Eli asked. He didn't need to say who. His fingers twisted the fringe of his blanket, the motion frantic. Grace fought down a wave of nausea. He doesn't. Not tonight. We're safe. But she didn't believe it. Not yet. Her hands shook so bad she almost pulled over, just to breathe. But the storm was thickening. If they stopped, they'd never get going again. Still, her thoughts kept circling. Where do you run when all you want is safety? How do you find hope in the dark? Another mile. The truck fishtailed, skidding dangerously close to the edge of the road, where a tangle of pines waited. Grace's heart leapt into her throat, but she righted the wheel, steadying them with sheer willpower. She glanced at Eli again. His lips were blue. Without thinking, she reached into the back seat, found an old, half-broken thermos, and poured out the last of the lukewarm cocoa. Here, drink this. We're almost there. Eli drank, his hands trembling. For a moment, his gaze met hers, pleading, trusting, terrified. Will it always be like this? He asked. The words nearly broke her. All she wanted was to tell him no, that good things waited just around the corner, that happy endings existed. But out here in the blizzard, with the world erased by white, it was hard to believe in anything but the storm. She looked out at the night, at the wild, uncaring world beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, a wolf howled, long and mournful, the sound swallowed by wind. It felt like the cry of every mother running from something she couldn't outrun. The engine coughed, stuttered, threatened to die. Grace whispered another prayer, urging it on. They'd left it all behind. The bruises, the fear, the lies. All she could do now was drive into the unknown, gripping hope like the steering wheel, refusing to let go, even as the night howled and the blizzard closed in. And in that moment, as the snow thickened and the old pickup rattled on, Grace made herself a promise. No matter what waited out there, she would never let Eli be alone in the dark again. The night pressed in thicker than ever, the blizzard hammering at the windows like 1,000 frantic hands. Grace's fingers cramped on the steering wheel as the truck jolted, every rut in the half-buried road a fresh punch of dread. The headlights flickered. Beneath their weak glow, the world was pure white chaos, wind-driven snow streaming sideways, tree limbs groaning overhead. The old engine began to cough and protest, each sound a warning she tried to ignore. But she knew, old machines, like old fears, rarely gave you any real warning before they quit for good. And then, just past a fallen spruce, the truck sputtered violently and died. The silence that followed was complete. No rumble, no heater, just the roar of the blizzard and Eli's sharp intake of breath. No, no, no. Grace turned the key again, willing the engine to life. It choked, rattled, and finally fell still. A cold sweat broke over her skin. For a moment she sat there, the darkness closing in, and let the reality hit her. They were stranded, alone, miles from any town, the temperature dropping by the second. Eli's voice was a ghost in the dark. "Mom?" "We're okay." Her answer was automatic, meant for him as much as herself. We just need to find shelter. She dug through the glove compartment, found an old flashlight and a crumpled map that offered no comfort. The light was dim, barely a pale circle on the snow, but it would have to do. She zipped Eli into the thickest jacket she had, layered his sweater over his pajamas, and wrapped the orange blanket around him like a cocoon. Then, with a deep breath, she opened the door. Snow blasted in, stinging her face, and she immediately lost her bearings in the storm. "Stick close," she ordered, voice rough. "Don't let go of my hand." They trudged into the swirling white, boots sinking in drifts up to their knees. The forest pressed close, dark shapes looming out of the snow, branches groaning and snapping. Grace's breath came in hard gasps, each one a cloud in the freezing air. The wind stole sound and sense. Each step felt heavier, the snow soaking through her jeans, her boots filling with icy slush. She pressed forward, desperate, the beam of the flashlight barely cutting through the swirling storm. She searched her memory for landmarks, for any sign of the abandoned cabin she'd heard about in town. It had been years since she'd come here as a girl, before fear and regret became daily companions. Eli stumbled, nearly falling, and she caught him, pulling him close. For a split second, the mother in her wanted to turn back, to give up and huddle in the broken-down truck. But she forced herself onward, muscles screaming. Suddenly, Eli yanked her arm, eyes wide with something beyond fear. "Look!" At first, Grace saw nothing, just snow and shadow. But then, in the wavering light, a shape materialized. A large animal, low to the ground, fur mottled and thick with frost. It limped, dragging its hind leg at a terrible angle. Two tiny forms huddled against its side. Bobcat kittens, one barely moving, the other still as stone. Grace froze, heart pounding so loud she could hear it above the wind. The bobcat raised its head, golden eyes fixed on them, every muscle tensed between terror and the instinct to defend. A mother, wild and desperate, cornered and bleeding into the snow. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Two mothers, two families, and trapped by a world that offered no mercy. "Is she going to hurt us?" Eli whispered, voice trembling but steady. Grace shook her head slowly. "She's protecting her babies." The flashlight flickered, and in that unsteady beam, she saw it. The rusty iron jaws of a trap, biting deep into the bobcat's leg. Blood stained the snow black. The second kitten lay awkward, too still, eyes open but glazed. The living cub whimpered, pressing against its mother's ribs. Something in Grace snapped. A memory of her own mother, a cold night, a broken arm, and no help coming. The look in the bobcat's eyes was the same as hers had been. Terrified, but defiant, refusing to give up. She knelt slowly, speaking in a low, calm voice. "We're not here to hurt you. We just want to help." Eli's hand squeezed hers. "We have to do something, Mom. She doesn't leave her baby. Don't leave her." For a moment, Grace hesitated, logic and fear battling in her chest. Wild animals, especially wounded ones, could be dangerous, but the snow was falling harder, the world growing colder and darker, and the only thing more terrifying than the wild was the thought of doing nothing. With shaking hands, Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out the multi-tool she kept for emergencies. She moved slowly, murmuring softly, inching toward the trap. The bobcat hissed, fur bristling, but didn't move. She couldn't. "It's okay," Grace whispered, her own tears freezing on her cheeks. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too." She pried at the trap, metal freezing her skin, fingers numb. Eli knelt beside her, gently stroking the cub's fur, voice low and steady. "Hang on, Mama. Hang on." With a sudden, desperate effort, Grace forced the trap open. The bobcat jerked free, collapsing in the snow, breath rasping. Grace wrapped her scarf around the bleeding leg, then, with Eli's help, lifted the wounded animal into her arms, cradling her like she would a frightened child. "We have to go," she said, urgency rising. The wind was howling louder. Somewhere far off, a tree snapped with a crack like gunfire. "The cabin's close, I think. We have to try." Eli nodded, still holding the surviving cub. Together, stumbling and shivering, they pressed deeper into the blizzard. Two humans, two wild souls, drawn together by the oldest instinct in the world, a mother's need to protect her young. As they vanished into the storm, the boundaries between human and wild, between fear and courage, began to blur, leaving only the raw, stubborn hope that somehow, together, they would survive. Snow drove into their faces like 1,000 icy needles as Grace and Eli staggered through the trees, the flashlight's circle of light trembling wildly in Grace's shaking hand. Each step was a struggle, feet sinking in knee-deep drifts, the cold gnawing at every inch of exposed skin. The wind seemed to claw at them, howling through the black branches, trying to pull them back toward the truck, toward the life they'd risked everything to escape. But Grace couldn't turn around now, not with Eli at her side, and not with the bobcat limp and heavy in her arms, blood from the wounded leg staining her coat. Eli followed close, his arms cradling the surviving cub, the orange blanket flapping behind him like a desperate flag. The dead cub was left behind in the snow, a small, silent shape swallowed quickly by the storm, but the pain of it weighed on all of them. The surviving kitten made a pitiful, high-pitched mewling sound, and the wild mother, despite her pain, lifted her head to lick its matted fur. Her eyes flashed with animal fear and something deeper, something Grace recognized, a mother's refusal to let go. The forest felt endless, a maze of skeletal trees and shifting shadows. Grace's mind whirled with panic and exhaustion, torn between the primal urge to keep moving and the dread that she'd gotten them hopelessly lost. Every now and then, she glanced down at the bobcat in her arms, half expecting the wild creature to turn on her in fear or pain. But the animal was still, sides heaving, gaze fixed on Eli, who spoke to her in a steady, gentle whisper. "We're almost there, Mama," Eli said, voice thin but sure. "Don't give up. Please don't give up." His words echoed the desperate hope pounding in Grace's chest. For a flicker of a second, she wondered if she was being foolish, risking her son, risking herself, for a wounded animal that belonged to the wild. But something about the bobcat's eyes, the silent strength in her battered body, made it impossible to let go. Grace had felt trapped herself for years, and now, staring down at those golden, defiant eyes, she realized just how much she needed this act of mercy, not only for the animal, but for her own soul. The wind gusted again, nearly knocking them off their feet. Grace braced herself against a tree, heart racing, vision blurring. She pressed on, lips numb, thinking of every story she'd ever heard about people freezing to death in the Montana woods. But then, through the blinding snow, she spotted something. A faint, angular shape rising up from the whiteness. The abandoned cabin, barely more than a shadow, its roof bowed under the weight of the storm. "There," she gasped, voice raw. "Eli, do you see it?" Eli squinted into the swirling white, his face lighting with hope. "Yeah, I see it. Come on, Mom." They stumbled forward, half running, half falling, the last few yards an eternity. The cabin's door hung half open, battered and splintered. Inside, the air was stale and bitterly cold, the floor covered in a thin skin of frost. The walls groaned in the wind, but it was shelter, barely, but enough. Grace nearly collapsed as she set the Bobcat down in a corner, her arms shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. The wildcat tensed, every muscle quivering, but didn't attack. Instead, she curled protectively around her surviving cub, breathing hard, eyes never leaving Eli. Grace knelt beside them, fumbling with numb fingers to check the wound. The rusty trap had torn a jagged gash through fur and flesh. Blood oozed, but not as badly now that the pressure was off. Grace pressed her scarf tighter around the injury, then wrapped them both in an old burlap sack she found in a pile of abandoned tools. Eli hovered nearby, shivering uncontrollably. Grace hurried to pull him close, rubbing his arms and blowing warm breath into his hands. "We did it," she whispered, not sure who she was trying to convince. "We made it." But as she looked at the wild mother, at Eli, and back to the storm still raging outside, Grace's doubts flooded back. Had she done the right thing? Had she put her own child at risk for an animal that might never understand or forgive? For a few long moments, the fear gnawed at her. What if the Bobcat turned on them? What if the injury was too severe? What if no one made it through the night? Eli broke the silence, his voice small but steady. "She saved her baby, Mom. You saved her. You couldn't leave her behind." Grace swallowed hard, fighting tears that stung her frozen cheeks. "Sometimes you have to take a chance, honey. Sometimes helping someone else is the only way to save yourself." She pulled him close, feeling the trembling of his small body, and for a moment, they just sat together. Two humans and a pair of wild, battered survivors, huddled against the night. The storm howled, shaking the little cabin on its foundation. But inside, for the first time in years, Grace felt something like hope flicker alive. She found a battered old lantern, fingers numb as she coaxed a flame to life. The yellow light danced across the cracked walls, painting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Eli sat beside the Bobcat, stroking the kitten's ears, whispering stories about heroes and mothers and impossible escapes. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside something had shifted, a boundary crossed, a choice made. The wild mother watched Grace with wary respect, her gaze softening as Eli draped the orange blanket over her cub. For a moment, the line between human and wild blurred, leaving only the desperate courage of mothers who would risk anything for their young. And as the night deepened, Grace found herself daring, just barely, to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could all survive this together. The wind beat against the cabin walls in heavy, shuddering waves, rattling loose planks and whistling through cracks. Grace pressed her back to the door, shivering as she slid the rusty latch into place. The air inside was bitterly cold, each breath blooming in white puffs that quickly vanished. It felt less like shelter and more like a grave, yet it was the only thing standing between them and the merciless Montana night. Eli hovered nearby, his teeth chattering, holding the shivering Bobcat cub in his lap. The mother Bobcat lay curled in the corner, her mangled legs stretched out, eyes fixed on the two humans, watchful, exhausted, but never surrendering her vigilance. She licked the cub's ear with slow, painful movements, as if she could will life back into its tiny body. Grace scanned the cramped, dark space by flashlight. There was little here. An upturned crate, broken chair legs, a pile of ancient magazines covered in frost. Old newspapers fluttered under the windows, the headlines faded to ghosts. Every surface was coated in a rime of ice. She moved quickly, the urgency of survival pushing away her fear and exhaustion. Her hands were raw and bleeding from cold, but she forced herself to scavenge the cabin for anything burnable. She ripped slats from the broken chair, stacked splinters of wood in the rusty fireplace, and clawed apart a mildewed crate, feeding its splinters to the pile. But when she flicked her lighter, once, twice, only a weak spark jumped in the darkness. The wood was too damp, too cold, refusing to catch. Panic threatened to rise in her chest. If they couldn't get a fire going, it wouldn't matter that they'd escaped. The cold would finish what the blizzard started. Eli looked up at her, blue-lipped and frightened. "Mom, I'm so cold." Grace gritted her teeth, forcing her shaking fingers to dig deeper. She found a battered cardboard box under a pile of newspapers, stuffed with forgotten treasures. A child's watercolor set, half-used candles, a dog-eared novel. Desperate, she tore the book's cover. Little Women, its title nearly rubbed away, and ripped out the pages, crumpling them into kindling. "Sorry, Joe," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We need you more as fire than story tonight." The lighter flickered. The paper caught. First a thread of smoke, then a small orange tongue of flame. Grace fed it carefully, hands cupped around the spark. The fire stuttered, threatened to die, then bloomed brighter as she added bits of chair and crate. A faint warmth spread through the tiny room, a mercy that felt like a miracle. Eli inched closer, hugging the bobcat cub to his chest, their breaths mingling in the rising heat. The wild mother watched, wary but grateful, her eyes half closed in exhaustion. Grace tore another blanket from her bag, wrapping it around Eli's shoulders. The three huddled by the fragile fire, an uneasy alliance born of desperation. Outside, the storm roared, battering the roof with fists of snow. Branches scraped across the windows like the claws of some ancient monster. But inside, the orange glow of the fire painted their faces with hope. Grace busied herself tending to the bobcat's wound, unspooling a roll of gauze from her first aid kit. The injury was worse than she'd realized, a deep, ragged tear oozing blood. The wild cat growled low in her throat, but didn't lash out. Grace moved carefully, talking in low, soothing tones, pressing her scarf tighter around the leg. She cleaned the wound with melted snow, then threaded a sewing needle and stitched the gash closed with trembling hands. Each pass of the needle was a small act of defiance, against the storm, against despair, against the cruelty of the world. The bobcat endured, silent, the muscles in her jaw working. Grace saw something ancient in those eyes, something fierce and undefeated, and for a moment she felt their souls touch, a recognition of pain and the refusal to surrender. Eli sat quietly by the fire, the cub curled in his lap, its tiny chest rising and falling with labored breaths. He told stories in a hushed voice, about warm summer days, about horses and rivers and things he barely remembered from before. Sometimes, the bobcat's ears would twitch as if she understood. The hours stretched, time measured by the fire's rise and fall. Grace tore more pages from the book, feeding the flames, each chapter disappearing into warmth. She wondered if she would ever tell Eli these stories, if there would be a time for happy endings. For now, the only story that mattered was survival. At one point, a sudden gust blew open the cabin's loose window, spraying them with snow. Grace leapt up, heart racing, and wedged the crate against the gap. She checked the door, pressed her ear against the wood. No sound but the wind. No footsteps. No angry shouts. Still, she bolted the door again, fear pulsing in her veins. Back by the fire, she found Eli finally drifting into sleep, his head resting on the bobcat's side. The wild mother lifted her gaze, meeting Grace's eyes. In that moment, a silent truce was struck. 3 survivors, bound by the fire, by pain, and by the stubborn will to protect what little they had left. The night dragged on, the storm outside raging, but inside, in that fragile circle of light, 3 kinds of courage pressed on, human, child, and wild, each refusing to give up, even as the world howled and darkness waited beyond the door. Morning came with no fanfare, only a pale, cold light seeping through the frost-caked window. The storm outside had eased, but the world remained muffled, silent as a graveyard beneath the deep snow. Inside the cabin, the makeshift fire had burned low to glowing embers. Grace lay awake on the hard floor, her arm curled protectively around Eli, whose breath came slow and steady against her shoulder. Across the small room, the mother bobcat and her cub were a tangle of golden fur, both breathing, still alive. Grace stretched, her joints stiff, her back aching from the cold, and a night spent listening to every sound. The wind's moan, Eli's soft whimpers, the occasional snuffling breath of the bobcat. For a while, she simply watched her son, memorizing the gentle curve of his cheek and the way his fingers clung to the orange blanket, as if it were the last thing tethering him to safety. For the first time in weeks, Eli looked peaceful. The tension in his small face had faded, replaced by a softness Grace hadn't seen since before they'd fled, before nights of hiding, before angry voices and slamming doors had replaced bedtime stories. The sight made her throat ache. It felt like proof, small and precious, that she'd made the right choice to run. The bobcat stirred. The wound on her leg had scabbed, a messy line of black stitches holding the flesh together. She watched Grace with wary intelligence, but didn't move away when Grace rose, stretching the stiffness from her limbs. Grace crossed to the window, scraping frost with the edge of an old magazine. Outside, the forest was transformed. Heavy snow weighed the pines, bowing them like old men. Rabbit tracks crossed the drifts, and far off, something dark, a fox maybe, moved quick and silent along the edge of the trees. For a moment, Grace felt the wildness seep into her bones, as if the blizzard had stripped away every soft comfort, leaving only what mattered. Breath, warmth, survival. She turned back, surveying their supplies. Not much was left. A nearly empty bag of crackers, 2 bruised apples, half a sleeve of stale cookies, and the melted remnants of a chocolate bar from the glove box. Water came from snow melted over the fire, each cup a victory over the cold. Eli woke with a start, eyes wide. He reached out, patting the bobcat cub, who blinked at him, tail flicking. The wild mother, too tired to object, watched with something that almost looked like trust. Grace smiled and handed Eli a cracker. "Eat slow, okay? We don't know how long we'll be here." Eli nibbled, sharing crumbs with the cub. "Is she going to get better, Mom?" Grace looked at the bobcat, her matted fur and haunted eyes, and felt hope and fear twist inside her. "She's a fighter," she said. "She made it through the night. That's what matters." For 3 days, the routine was the same. Grace tended the wound with thread and needle, replacing bandages torn from her own shirt. She scavenged the abandoned cabin for scraps, burned chair legs, the last pages of the novel, even strips of old linoleum to keep the wind from whistling up through the floor. Each day, she rationed the food, dividing every last bite between Eli, the cub, and their wild guest. The bobcat accepted small pieces of apple and cookie, her hunger too great for pride. At night, with the fire burning low and shadows stretching long across the floor, Eli whispered stories to the bobcat, his voice soft and dreamy. Sometimes he told fairy tales from memory. Other times he invented new ones about the brave snowcat and her baby, lost in the storm, searching for home. He described wild adventures, fording icy rivers, chasing crows, finding secret dens beneath the roots of ancient trees. And sometimes, between stories, Grace saw something shift in the wild mother's gaze. Her guard dropped, just a little, and she'd inch closer to the fire, letting Eli stroke her fur. The cub would curl up in his lap, purring so quietly only Grace could hear it. For the first time, she saw Eli drift off to sleep with a small smile on his lips. The old fears pushed back by warmth, by stories, by the fragile bond growing between them all. Grace stayed up most nights, listening to the forest and thinking about all the ways life could break you. How sometimes the only thing you had was the hope you'd make it through until morning. She wondered if the bobcat was dreaming of her own wild world, if she understood that for now, her survival was tangled up with theirs. On the third night, the cabin grew eerily quiet, the storm's rage replaced by a heavy stillness. Grace sat near the dying fire, Eli curled against her, the bobcat and her cub nestled close. The silence wasn't empty. It was a different kind of wild, a fragile peace, trembling but real. Grace felt her heartbeat slow. The world outside was still full of danger, but inside the tiny cabin, hope clung on, stubborn and bright. She realized she wasn't just fighting for escape anymore. She was fighting to hold on to this flicker of warmth, of connection, in a world that could freeze you solid if you let it. Eli murmured in his sleep, "It's okay, Mama. You're safe now." The words settled over Grace like a blessing. In the hush, she watched the wild mother lick her cub's ear and knew, for a moment, for this night, they were all safe. 3 kinds of courage, human, child, and wild, sharing the fragile gift of hope. Outside, the snow kept falling, silent and unending, but inside the fire still glowed, and 3 battered survivors pressed close, refusing to let the night win. The cold pressed in hard, but Grace barely noticed it. By the 4th day, her body was running on instinct and adrenaline, nerves stretched taut as barbed wire. Every creak of the wind, every moan of the trees, made her start. The little food they'd scraped together was nearly gone, but hunger seemed less urgent than the prickle of fear working under her skin. Morning came as a blue-gray smear behind the trees. Grace woke to Eli's soft breathing and the rhythmic purr of the bobcat cub curled against his chest. The fire was down to embers. She sat up carefully, muscles stiff, and listened. The woods had settled into a heavy, watchful silence, broken only by the distant cry of a raven and the occasional thump of snow falling from the eaves. She tried to make a plan. How much longer could they last here? Was it time to move? The storm had eased, leaving a world transformed, white, silent, and so thick with snow that the old forest trail had vanished. Grace slipped on her boots, crept to the window, and scraped away a patch of frost. Her breath caught. Something was different. In the thin early light, she saw tire tracks, fresh, clear, running parallel to the tree line, no more than 100 yards from the cabin. She froze. In all the days they'd been there, not a single car or snowmobile had disturbed the woods. Her pulse hammered as she ducked back from the window, heart pounding so loud she worried Eli might wake. She moved quickly, quietly, dousing what was left of the fire. The room filled with smoke and bitter cold. Grace grabbed the few supplies they had and stashed them beneath a loose floorboard. The bobcat roused, ears flicking at the scent of danger. Eli stirred and blinked up at her. "Mom? What's wrong?" Grace knelt beside him, keeping her voice steady, gentle. "There's someone out there. We need to be ready. If anything happens, if you hear shouting, or if I tell you to, run as fast as you can, straight for the creek. Don't look back. Got it?" Fear flickered in Eli's eyes, but he nodded, face serious. "What about you?" Grace squeezed his hand. "I'll be right behind you, but you listen for the bobcat too. If she growls, it means danger, but she's protecting you, understand?" Eli nodded again, clutching the orange blanket tighter. The bobcat, though wounded, rose slowly to her feet, positioning herself between Eli and the door. Her golden eyes locked onto Grace, then the window. The cub bristled, but stayed pressed to Eli's side. Grace moved to block the windows with broken boards and old newspapers, stuffing every crack. She worked quickly, remembering old stories her mother told her about hiding during storms, not from the weather, but from men. For a moment, the past pressed in hard. She thought about the rage in his eyes, the promises he'd made if she ever left. But then she looked at Eli, cheeks pink with cold, and the bobcat, defiant despite her pain, and she knew she could not let fear win. She crouched in the shadow, every muscle tight. Minutes dragged by, then an hour, each tick of the clock like thunder in her ears. The only sound was the wind outside and Eli's nervous breathing. He clung to the cub, whispering comfort. "It's okay, Mama Cat. We'll protect you." Grace strained to hear any sound, an engine, footsteps crunching in snow, a shout. But the world outside was unnaturally still. The tire tracks could mean anything. A lost hunter, a ranger, or something far worse. Maybe he had found them. Maybe he'd brought others. Her mind raced. Should they run now? The snow was deep, the woods disorienting. She risked another glance through the crack in the boarded window. The tracks were clearer now, the sun glinting off packed ice. There were footprints, too. Boot prints, heavy and fresh, moving toward the tree line, then circling back. Panic fluttered at the edge of her thoughts. Grace steadied herself, recalling the steely calm that had carried her this far. She reached for her multi-tool, checking its blade. Not much, but it was something. She checked the latch on the door again, then slipped her coat on and pressed her ear to the wood. Outside, the forest stretched vast and indifferent, but somewhere in all that white silence, someone was moving. She could feel it, the way the air changed, the way the animals had gone quiet. Eli watched her, eyes big and worried. "Are we safe, Mom?" Grace forced a smile, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "We're together. That's what matters. Whatever happens, we face it together." The hours crawled by. Now and then, a branch snapped outside, and Grace would tense, ready to grab Eli and bolt. The bobcat would growl low, her body tense, protecting her cub and the boy as if they were all one family now. As the sky deepened to indigo, Grace realized what had changed. They were no longer just running. They were standing their ground, fragile and scared, but together. She couldn't say what tomorrow would bring, but tonight the fear was no longer just hers to carry. She kept vigil by the door, listening for danger. The bobcat, despite her injury, stayed alert, her body a living shield for Eli and her cub. That night, as darkness closed in and the snow whispered against the roof, Grace knew. Survival was no longer about escaping, but about standing up, protecting each other, and facing the storm as one. Night fell hard and fast, swallowing the woods in a blue-black haze. Grace watched the light slip from the world, each shadow stretching longer, each sound outside turning sharp. She pressed herself close to Eli, his small hands gripping the orange blanket, knuckles white. The bobcat paced between the door and the makeshift barricade, her limp growing worse but her gaze unwavering, protective, wild, ready for whatever might come. The cabin was thick with silence. The only sounds were Eli's shallow breaths and the scratch of the mother bobcat's claws across the wood floor. Even the cub, usually restless at night, pressed close to Eli, purring in uneasy rhythm with his heartbeat. Grace's nerves jangled, her senses strained for any hint of what might be lurking beyond the walls. The memory of those tire tracks burned in her mind. She clung to hope that it was only a passing hunter, but every instinct screamed that something more dangerous was circling. The night outside was too quiet, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Eli whispered, "Do you think he's out there, Mom?" His voice trembled, fragile as glass. Grace wrapped her arms around him, smoothing his hair back. "I don't know, honey, but we're not alone. We're together, and that's enough." She forced herself to believe it, even as dread curled cold and sharp inside her. She remembered the threats, the look in his eyes the night she'd left, the promise that she'd never get away. Now, the darkness pressed in as if those words had become real and heavy as the snow on the roof. Suddenly, through the thick black of the window, a faint flicker of light appeared. Grace's breath caught. Headlights, weaving slowly down the ridge, sweeping between the bare trees, growing brighter, searching. Panic flooded her veins. "Eli," she hissed, "hide behind the crates. Quiet. Now." She grabbed the multi-tool, the only weapon she had, and checked the barricade at the door. Her hands shook, but she moved quietly, every motion deliberate. Eli scampered to the darkest corner, pulling the cub close. The mother bobcat positioned herself in front of him, ears flat, shoulders hunched, her body forming a wall between the boy and whatever danger threatened. The headlights drew closer, bouncing across the rough ground, sweeping over the broken fence and shattered porch. The engine's rumble was muffled by snow but growing louder. Closer, a predator in the night. Grace pressed herself to the wall, forcing herself to breathe slowly. She whispered a silent prayer, not just for herself and Eli, but for the wild mother beside them. For the first time, she felt their fear and courage mingled, a pack, a family. The vehicle stopped, doors creaked open, heavy boots crunched on the frozen ground. Someone shouted, a man's voice, rough and impatient, echoing through the trees. "I know you're in there. Come out now and I won't make it worse." Eli whimpered. The bobcat let out a low, chilling growl, the sound vibrating through the tiny cabin. Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, willing her heart to slow. She knew that voice. He'd found them. A fist pounded on the door, the thin wood shaking with each blow. The mother bobcat arched her back, eyes burning, every muscle tensed to strike. Grace crouched lower, holding the multi-tool like a talisman. "Don't make a sound," she mouthed to Eli, then turned her gaze to the bobcat, as if drawing strength from her. The man outside cursed, rattled the doorknob, then kicked the door hard enough to splinter the old frame. For a terrifying second, it seemed the door would burst open, but the crates held, the old latch just barely resisting. The headlights swept the windows, turning the cabin's icy glass to blinding gold. Shadows danced across the walls. The mother bobcat growled again, louder, a sound that was more than animal, a warning, a promise of violence. There was a long silence. Footsteps crunched away, circled the house, then paused. The man's voice, closer now, snarled through the night. "Last chance. I'll let the cold do my work if I have to." Grace's mind raced. If he smashed a window, they'd be exposed. If he set the cabin on fire, there would be no escape. She locked eyes with the bobcat, her own fear reflected in the animal's fierce, wild gaze. Eli whimpered, squeezing the cub tighter, his whole body shaking. Grace reached back, took his hand, squeezed hard. "It's okay. We're okay. I won't let anything happen to you. Not ever." The footsteps circled once more. Then the sound of boots faded, replaced by the engine's growl. The headlights swept the woods, then slowly, mercifully, receded. The man was gone, but Grace knew he might return. The danger had passed, but its shadow lingered, heavy and suffocating. In the silence that followed, the mother bobcat limped over to Eli, curling herself around him and the cub. Grace dropped the multi-tool and pulled her son into her arms, tears streaking her cheeks. Sometimes protection was silent and fierce. Sometimes it was wild, and sometimes it was the shared courage of those who refused to give in. Outside, the woods fell quiet again, but the bond in that battered cabin was stronger than fear. Grace, Eli, the mother bobcat, and her cub, 4 survivors, their destinies intertwined by one storm, one night, and one unbreakable promise. They would face the darkness together. Dawn crept in slowly, casting pale blue light across the battered cabin floor. The headlights and shouting of the night before seemed to belong to another world, a nightmare that faded only when the first rays of sun slipped through the frost-rimmed window. For a long while, Grace lay motionless, Eli tucked into the curve of her arm, the bobcat and her cub curled together in a tight ball of fur. She listened to their breathing and the wind pressing gently at the walls, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for her decision. She could hear Eli's heartbeat, a faint, steady drum against her side. He stirred, blinking sleep from his eyes. For a moment, he was just a boy again. All the fear and worry melted away by the warmth of his mother's arms and the comfort of the small, wild family sharing their space. He smiled when the bobcat cub stretched and yawned, then tumbled across his lap in a fit of playful energy. The mother bobcat watched, her eyes no longer as wild with terror but cautious, steady, alive. Grace sat up, rubbing the ache from her neck and shoulders. She crossed to the window and scraped away a thin layer of frost with her knuckle. The world outside was sparkling, a vast, unbroken sheet of snow glittering in the morning sun. Smoke curled faintly from their abandoned fire. Above, a hawk soared, tracing lazy circles in the sky. No tracks, no headlights, just silence and the slow return of life. She looked back at Eli, who laughed for the first time in months as the cub leapt on its mother's back, rolling in a bundle of paws and tails. The sound filled the tiny room, chasing away shadows, and Grace found herself smiling through tears she didn't remember starting. For so long, every day had been survival, running, hiding, flinching at every sound. But in this fragile peace, with sunlight streaming in, something else began to take root. "Do we have to go?" Eli asked quietly, his hand resting on the mother bobcat's flank. I think she needs us. She's not ready. Grace felt the weight of that question. Her mind replayed the night before. The pounding on the door, the snarling voice, the headlights. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to keep moving, to stay invisible. But another feeling tugged at her, a deep, aching need to choose something other than fear. To give herself and Eli, and even the wild mother, a chance to heal. She knelt beside Eli, brushing his hair from his eyes. If we stay, we have to be careful. We can't light the fire during the day, only after dark. We have to keep watch, make sure no one's coming. It's not safe, not really. But maybe... She hesitated, searching for the words. Maybe it's time to stop running, at least for a little while. Eli hugged her tight, pressing his cheek to her chest. I don't want to be scared forever, Mom. I want to help her get better. I want us to have a home, even if it's just for now. Grace held him, feeling the truth of his words seep into her bones. She watched as the mother bobcat lifted her head, met her eyes with that unblinking, wild gaze, no longer pleading, but accepting. A silent understanding passed between them. Two mothers, both battered but unbroken, choosing to stay a little longer for the ones they loved. The days passed, slow and deliberate. Grace rationed the last scraps of food and melted snow over the dying fire at night. She foraged near the tree line, gathering handfuls of berries and bitter greens, watching always for movement, human or animal. She checked the bobcat's wound each morning, replacing the bandages, cleaning the stitches with snowmelt. The animal's strength returned slowly, a little more each day. The limp remained, but the fire in her eyes grew brighter. Eli became a caretaker in his own right. He invented games for the cub, tossing bits of string and scraps of blanket for it to pounce. At night, he told new stories about bobcats and lost boys, about mothers who never gave up, about secret places in the woods where you could hide from anything, even fear. Sometimes Grace listened from the doorway, her heart so full she could barely breathe. They built routines out of small things, gathering firewood, mending cracks in the walls, melting snow. Each task felt sacred, a promise to themselves and to the wild family sharing their shelter. The days were still hard, always balanced on the edge of hunger and cold, but laughter began to come more easily, and the silences were no longer so heavy. One afternoon, as Grace washed the bobcat's wound, Eli sat beside her, his face flushed with hope. We're not just running anymore, Mom. We're living right here. The words echoed through the cabin, banishing the last shadows of fear. Grace realized he was right. In risking comfort for another, in choosing to stay, they had reclaimed a piece of their lives. They were healing, slowly, painfully, but truly. That night, as the sun set and the first stars prickled through the trees, Grace sat with Eli and the wild mother by the fire. The bobcat nuzzled her cub, purring with a contentment Grace had never seen before. Eli leaned into her side, whispering dreams of tomorrow. For the first time since the blizzard, Grace let herself hope, not just for survival, but for something more. For a new beginning, no matter how small, born from the courage to stay and care and trust. The world outside was still full of danger, but inside that tiny cabin, they had found something stronger, fragile, stubborn, and real. A pale dawn broke over the mountains, turning the world outside the cabin into a shimmering wonderland of ice and snow. Frost edged every window, painting delicate patterns across the glass. Inside, Grace awoke with a start, heart pounding as if she'd been running. For a moment, she lay there, holding Eli close, listening to the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the gentle purr of the bobcat cub, and the deep, almost inaudible rumble from the mother cat. Something was different. The tension in the room, once so thick it felt suffocating, had lifted. It was as if the storm, the fear, the constant threat of being found had finally eased its grip. Grace sat up quietly, careful not to wake Eli. The fire had burned down to embers, but the cabin was warmer than it had been in days. The air was filled with a new energy, anticipation, bittersweet and heavy. She glanced across the room. The mother bobcat was awake, eyes sharp, nostrils flaring as she tasted the dawn on the air. Her leg, still bandaged but healing, moved with less stiffness now. The cub pressed close to her side, looking up at its mother as if asking what came next. Grace felt a swell of emotion, fierce and aching. This wild creature had become part of their small, fragile family, but the wild was calling her back. There was no mistaking it. Grace stood and went to the window, scraping away frost to peer into the breaking day. The world was silent but alive. The snow outside trampled with the tracks of rabbits, deer, and, most recently, bobcat. She saw it then, faint paw prints leading from the trees toward the cabin, as if the wild mother had been called by something only she could hear. A soft rustle behind her. She turned to see Eli waking, rubbing his eyes. He blinked at the sunlight, then at the bobcat and her cub. His face crumpled with understanding. "She's leaving, isn't she?" Grace nodded, her own eyes stinging. She knelt beside Eli, wrapping him in her arms. She has to. She's strong again. She belongs out there. Eli's voice was small but steady. "Can we say goodbye?" They moved together to the door, opening it wide to the cold morning. The wild mother stood, limping but powerful, and nuzzled her cub. For a moment, she looked back at Grace and Eli, eyes filled with a wild intelligence that seemed almost human. No fear now, just understanding, gratitude, and the restless longing for freedom. Grace whispered, her voice breaking, "Go on. Every mother needs her own wild." The bobcat stepped outside, her breath swirling in the cold air. She paused at the edge of the trees, the cub hesitating behind her. The mother looked back one last time, eyes locking with Grace's, a silent message that needed no words. Eli wiped away a tear, kneeling in the snow and waving goodbye. The bobcat flicked her tail, then led her cub into the trees, disappearing among the shadows and shafts of early light. For a long moment, Grace and Eli watched the place where the wild family had vanished. All that remained were paw prints, a trail leading out into the white, proof that they had survived, that hope was real. Grace felt a deep, shivering ache, not regret, but a fierce pride. She had risked everything for her son, for a wild creature wounded by the world, and in that risk had found a new kind of courage. Not the loud, desperate kind, but the strength it takes to stand beside someone, to protect them, and finally, to let them go. Eli's hand found hers. "Do you think she'll remember us?" Grace smiled, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I think so. And every time it snows, we'll remember her too." They went back inside, closing the door gently behind them. The cabin felt emptier, but not lonely. Instead, it was filled with memories of fear faced, wounds healed, and the moment when hope broke through the cold. As they packed what little they had, preparing to leave, Grace found herself lingering over every small detail: the burn marks on the floor from the first desperate fire, the blanket torn and patched, the scratches on the door from the bobcat's claws. Each scar told a story, not of weakness, but of survival. She gathered Eli into her arms, holding him tight. "You were so brave, Eli. I'm proud of you." He hugged her back fiercely. "You were brave too, Mom. You didn't leave her behind." Grace thought of the life they'd left, of the fear that had chased them through storm and darkness. She realized she wasn't running anymore. She was choosing to protect, to help, and, when the time came, to let go. That was the lesson the wild had given her. At dawn, with the sun gleaming on the snow, they stepped outside together. They followed the bobcat's tracks as far as the tree line, letting the cold bite their cheeks, letting the fresh morning air fill their lungs. Each step felt lighter, unburdened by fear. Before leaving, Grace knelt and pressed her hand into the snow beside the bobcat's print, leaving her own mark, a promise to herself, to Eli, and to the wild mother who had trusted them. They turned toward the road, the forest behind them silent and watchful. As they walked, Eli looked back just once, then forward, his face set with a new kind of hope. Grace realized that true courage wasn't about running or fighting. It was standing together, protecting what you love, and letting go when the wild called. In the quiet hush of morning, as the world shimmered with possibility, Grace whispered a simple truth. Sometimes, the most important strength is quiet, protecting, not abandoning, even in the storm. And as they set out for a new beginning, the tracks they left in the snow joined those of the bobcat, woven together by one night's kindness, one hard winter, and the wild, unbreakable hope that comes from loving and letting go. Grace and Eli followed the frozen road beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Every step away from the cabin was heavy with memory, but also lightened by the sense that they were finally moving towards something, not just away. The crunch of their boots mingled with the hush of a world just waking from the storm's long hold. Behind them, the forest stood silent and wise, bearing witness as mother and son, once fugitives, now survivors, emerged from its embrace. Eli walked a half step ahead, his orange blanket wrapped around his shoulders like a hero's cape. His cheeks were red with cold, but his eyes held a spark that Grace hadn't seen in a long time. A quiet confidence born from hardship faced and survived. He glanced back once, as if searching for the bobcat and her cub among the trees, then turned his gaze forward toward the distant line of power poles and the promise of town beyond. The road twisted through the valley, past abandoned barns and snow-drifted fields. The journey was slow. Grace's legs ached with every mile, and hunger gnawed at her belly. But she kept going, fueled by something deeper than fear, a stubborn hope that they could begin again, this time on their own terms. By mid-morning, the spires of the small county town appeared through the shimmering cold. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the American flag in front of the courthouse fluttered stiffly in the breeze. For a moment, Grace hesitated, anxiety rising. This place was not home. Not yet. But Eli's hand found hers, squeezing tight, steadying her. They passed a group of children building a snowman in front of the diner, their laughter bright and innocent. A woman in a sheriff's uniform stopped shoveling her walkway to watch them, her expression curious but not unfriendly. Grace pulled Eli's hood tighter, nerves jangling, but the woman only nodded and went back to her work. At the edge of town, Grace paused before the brick steps of the sheriff's office. Her heart hammered in her chest, not from fear but from the gravity of the moment. She knelt in the snow, looking Eli in the eyes. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. Eli nodded. "We're not running anymore, Mom. We can tell them the truth." Together they climbed the steps. Inside, the office was warm and smelled faintly of coffee and wood polish. A young deputy looked up, startled, then beckoned them forward. Grace explained, her words halting at first, then gaining strength. The story of where they'd come from, what they'd survived, and why they needed help. The sheriff, a weathered woman with kind eyes, listened without interrupting. When Grace finished, she nodded slowly. "You did the right thing coming here. You're safe now." There was no judgment in her voice, only understanding, the kind that comes from having seen too many storms, too many people running from hurt. While the sheriff made calls and filled out paperwork, Eli sat by the frosted window, drawing shapes in the condensation with his finger. He sketched a small wildcat with pointed ears, a cub by its side, then turned and grinned at Grace. Outside, snow fell in soft, fat flakes, blanketing the world in newness. A social worker brought them hot cocoa and warm sandwiches. She spoke gently to Eli, complimenting his drawing, and asked Grace if she had any family nearby. Grace shook her head, then glanced at Eli. "We're all the family we need." In the days that followed, they settled into a small rental on the edge of town. The rooms were bare, but sunlight streamed in through the windows, warming the worn wooden floors. Neighbors dropped off casseroles and mittens, offering smiles that were shy at first, then warmer as the days passed. The local school welcomed Eli with open arms. He made a friend, a boy named Mason, who showed him how to slide down icy hills on a cardboard sled. On the first snowy morning in their new home, Eli drew a bobcat in the frost on his bedroom window, its tail arched proudly. He traced a smaller cub beside it, then turned to Grace. "Do you think they're okay out there?" he asked. Grace wrapped him in a hug, breathing in the clean, hopeful scent of his hair. "I know they are, and we're okay too. Bravery isn't about being loud, Eli. It's about being still and guarding what matters." They hung the orange blanket at the foot of Eli's bed, a symbol of everything they'd endured and overcome. Sometimes, at night, Grace would find Eli whispering stories to the wildcats drawn on his window, his words full of dreams and kindness. She would smile, knowing that while the past could not be erased, it had given them something fierce and good, a strength they would carry into every new beginning. As winter melted into spring, Grace found herself reaching out, volunteering at the animal shelter, helping neighbors shovel their drives, sharing quiet laughter over coffee at the corner diner. Her heart, once barricaded by fear, opened again, letting in the possibility of connection. She often thought about the wild mother and her cub. Sometimes when the moon was bright and the wind howled just right, she imagined she could hear the bobcat's cry echoing through the woods, a promise that survival was possible, even in the harshest winter. And as their story faded from town gossip into memory, Grace shared one final message, written in her journal and spoken aloud to Eli before bed. "For me, this story isn't just about a woman, her son, and a wild animal. It's about how courage and kindness echo across the wildest nights. If you've ever found hope in the quiet company of another, human or animal, share your story, or send it to someone who needs it. Sometimes all it takes is a single snowstorm to bring 3 lost souls home." The lesson stayed with them, etched in the frost on the window, in the tracks left behind in the snow, and in the way their hearts beat a little braver each morning. In that gentle, hopeful hush of their new life, Grace and Eli discovered that a single act of kindness could outlast even the longest winter, and that together they could weather any storm